What if the person sent to protect you became the one you couldn't stop thinking about? A late-night break-in, a frightened young man, and the police officer who arrived at his door, changing everything. This isn't just a BL webtoon moment. This is a yaoi manhwa love story where duty collides with desire, where safety transforms into intimacy. But here's the question. When the night ends, will their hearts retreat or finally confess? It started with fear. Eunjae lived alone in a small studio apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't a glamorous place, just one room with a kitchenette tucked into the corner, a second-hand sofa pushed against the wall, and a bed that sagged in the middle from too many restless nights. To anyone else, would have looked like an uninspired box of concrete and glass. But to Eunjae, it was supposed to be safe. A private corner of the world where he could read, write, and breathe without interruption. Yet the silence of that apartment wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind of silence that pressed against his ears, heavy and oppressive. The kind that made the hum of the refrigerator sound like a warning, and the creak of old wood feel like a threat. Eunjae had never realized how loud his imagination could be until he began living there alone. Every little sound was magnified at night, when the city beyond his walls dulled to a hush. That night, it wasn't just his imagination. The door rattled. At first, it was faint. So faint he thought maybe it was just the wind brushing against the metal. He held his breath, sitting up in bed, his pulse throbbing inside his throat. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself to lie back down, to close his eyes, to stop feeding into his own paranoia. But then it came again, louder, sharper. Someone was testing the lock. Eunjae's heart slammed against his ribs. He scrambled to his feet, bare toes gripping the cold floor. His body moved before his mind could catch up, instinct screaming at him to do something. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, fingers fumbling against the smooth glass screen. He almost dropped it in his panic, but managed to swipe it open and dial emergency services with trembling hands. Police, came the calm, professional voice on the other end. There's someone at my door. Eunjae's voice cracked, coming out too high, too frantic. He forced himself to whisper, as if the intruder could hear him through the walls. Someone's trying to break in. I live on the 3rd floor, building 42, apartment C. Stay calm, the operator said firmly. Officers are on the way. Do not open the door. Stay somewhere safe inside your apartment until help arrives. Somewhere safe. Eunjae's eyes darted around the room. Where? The closet. Under the bed. He hated himself for shaking so badly that even moving across the room felt impossible. He pressed himself against the farthest wall, clutching his phone like a lifeline. The rattling stopped. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating. Eunjae didn't dare breathe too loudly. His ears strained for the slightest sound, the squeak of a shoe, the scrape of a window frame. Time slowed, stretching seconds into hours. Then, footsteps, heavy ones, retreating down the hallway outside. Relief washed over him so quickly he almost cried. His knees gave out and he slid down against the wall, pressing his forehead to his drawn-up knees. But the relief didn't last long, because footsteps that retreated could just as easily return. And what if they did? By the time the knock came at his door, a strong, steady knock, nothing like the jittery rattling before. His nerves were shredded. He jolted upright, phone still clutched in his hand, eyes wide. "Mr. Park Eunjae," a deep, authoritative voice called from the other side. "It's the police. You called in a report?" His chest tightened with both relief and fear. Relieved it wasn't the intruder back again. Afraid still that even this voice might be a trick. "How do I know you're really the police?" Unjay stammered through the door. There was a pause, and the voice returned, calm, reassuring. "That's a smart question. My name is Officer Kang Do-hyun, badge number 3745. I can hold it up to the peephole if you'd like." Unjay hesitated, then crept forward on unsteady legs. He pressed one eye against the peephole and nearly gasped. The man outside was tall, broad-shouldered, his navy uniform neat and fitted. Even distorted through the fisheye glass, his presence radiated authority. He held up a badge exactly as promised, his hand steady. His eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the hallway even as he waited for Eunjae's answer. Slowly, Eunjae unlocked the chain and opened the door just enough to peek out. "Are you all right?" Officer Kang's gaze immediately flicked to him, scanning him from head to toe. "Did you see who it was?" Eunjae shook his head quickly. I only heard them." The lock rattled, and then footsteps. Do-hyun's eyes narrowed. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the tiny apartment in an instant. Eunjae staggered back, overwhelmed by the sheer size and confidence of the man. The officer moved methodically, checking the windows, the lock, even the flimsy sliding balcony door that Eunjae had always meant to reinforce but never had. Every motion was controlled, professional, but there was a quiet intensity in his expression that made Eunjae's pulse race. "You live alone?" Do-hyun asked without looking back at him. Yes." Do-hyun nodded, muttering something under his breath about vulnerable apartments and cheap locks. He finally turned back, meeting Eunjae's wide, frightened eyes, and in that moment something shifted. The officer's expression softened. "You're safe now," he said firmly. His voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that felt like a shield against the world. "But I don't like the look of that window, and whoever tried to break in might not be gone for good. I'll stay here tonight just to be sure." Eunjae's breath caught. "Stay." The word echoed in his mind, setting off a storm he didn't know how to name. Relief, because the thought of being alone again terrified him. Fear, because sharing his space, even with someone sent to protect him, felt like exposure. And something else, something he refused to acknowledge yet. He swallowed hard and nodded. Do-hyun pulled a chair near the door and settled in, posture upright, eyes still sharp as though he were carved from stone. Eunjae hovered by the sofa, arms wrapped around himself. For the next hour, the silence wasn't oppressive the way it had been before. But it wasn't comfortable either. It stretched, fragile and uncertain, like the first thread of a web spun between two strangers who had no idea how entangled they might become. Eunjae sat on the sofa, his knees pulled up to his chest, his arms hugging himself tight. He told himself it was just for warmth, that the night air creeping in through the thin walls was responsible for the goosebumps on his arms. But he knew better. His eyes drifted, again and again, toward the man by the door. Officer Kang Do-hyun sat in rigid stillness, posture perfectly upright, one hand resting casually near his utility belt, though his other hand relaxed over his thigh. His body radiated discipline, the kind that only years of training could carve into someone's very bones. Yet it wasn't stiffness. It was presence. He looked like he could sit there all night without faltering, without blinking, as if the weight of an entire building rested on his shoulders and he was ready to bear it. The dim glow of the single lamp lit his profile in sharp planes. The cut of his jaw, the slight shadow of stubble that hinted at long hours on duty, the straight line of his nose, and the steady set of his mouth. His eyes, dark and watchful, kept returning to the door, scanning it as though he could see threats beyond it. Unjay swallowed. He shouldn't be staring. He knew he shouldn't. But his gaze kept wandering back, as if drawn by some invisible gravity. He looks safe, Unjay thought. The word sounding absurd even inside his own mind. Safe wasn't supposed to look like broad shoulders and calloused hands. Safe wasn't supposed to make your heart race faster instead of calming it. And yet, every time Do-hyun shifted slightly, adjusting his chair or glancing at the window, Unjay's chest tightened with something he didn't want to name. The silence dragged. Unjay tried to distract himself. He fiddled with the corner of a throw pillow, picking at a loose thread until it came free. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Only 5 minutes had passed. He sighed, barely realizing he had done it aloud. That tiny sound drew Do-hyun's eyes. "Are you cold?" The officer's voice broke the quiet, deep and even, with just the faintest hint of gentleness beneath the authority. Unjay startled, shaking his head too quickly. No, just restless." Do-hyun regarded him for a long second, then gave a single nod, turning his gaze back toward the door. But that tiny exchange left the air different, thicker, more alive. Unjay's throat felt dry. He wanted to say something, anything, just to keep that voice filling the silence. But what could he ask? What could he say to a stranger who had stepped into his apartment like a wall of protection, and now sat between him and his nightmares? Finally, he blurted out the first thing that came to mind. Do you do this often?" Do-hyun's brow arched slightly. "Guard an apartment all night?" "Not usually, but it's part of the job. When someone's in danger, I don't leave them alone." The words sank deep. "I don't leave them alone." Unjay hugged his knees tighter, feeling warmth creep into his face. "Why did you become a cop?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Do-hyun turned his head, studying him with those sharp, unreadable eyes. For a moment, Unjay worried he had crossed some invisible line. But then the officer answered, his tone steady, almost thoughtful, because someone has to protect the ones who can't protect themselves. The simplicity of the answer made Unjay's chest ache. He ducked his head, staring at the fabric of his pajama pants as if it held the secrets of the universe. He didn't know why that response hit so hard. Maybe because he had spent so much of his life feeling unprotected. Maybe because hearing it spoken aloud in this tiny apartment made the words feel like they were meant for him. The silence returned, but this time it was different. Not oppressive, not heavy. It was charged. Every glance carried weight, every shift of breath felt amplified. Unjay stole another look at Do-hyun. He wasn't just strong. He was steady in a way that Unjay had never been. His life had always felt fragile, like porcelain that might crack if someone knocked too hard. But Do-hyun looked unbreakable, forged from steel and intention. "Do you always stay this still?" Unjay asked softly, curiosity outweighing caution now. A faint huff of amusement escaped the officer, so small Unjay almost doubted he had heard it. "Training," Do-hyun replied. "You learn to wait. You learn to stay ready. Stillness is part of the job." "That sounds exhausting." Do-hyun tilted his head slightly, finally letting his gaze linger on Unjay. "It can be, but it's worth it." Their eyes met for a heartbeat too long. Unjay looked away first, heat rising in his cheeks. His pulse hammered against his ribs, and he cursed himself for feeling like a teenager caught staring at his crush. The minutes crawled by. Unjay shifted on the sofa, trying to shake off the tension winding through his body. His leg brushed against the blanket draped over the armrest, and before he could second-guess himself, He grabbed it and pulled it over his lap. "You should rest," Do-hyun said suddenly, his voice low but firm. Eun-jae blinked. "Rest? With someone trying to break into my apartment. You'll be safe," Do-hyun assured him. "I'll keep watch. I don't sleep on duty." The certainty in his tone made Eun-jae's heart twist. He wanted to believe it, wanted so badly to let his body relax, to let someone else hold the weight for once. But he didn't lie down. Not yet. Instead, he whispered, "What about you? Don't you ever need someone to keep watch for you?" Do-hyun's eyes softened, just barely. He didn't answer right away. For a long time, he just looked at Eun-jae, as if searching for something in his expression. Finally, he murmured, "No one's ever asked me that before." The quiet that followed was thicker than any silence that had come before. Eun-jae's chest felt too tight, his body too small for the emotions pressing against it. He looked away, down at his hands twisting in the blanket. He didn't know what had compelled him to say that, but he knew one thing. Something had shifted between them. Something invisible, but undeniable. Eun-jae couldn't. He fidgeted. He shifted. He finally blurted out, "Why did you become a cop?" Do-hyun blinked, glancing at him for the first time since sitting down. The question seemed to surprise him, but his answer came without hesitation. "Because someone has to protect the ones who can't protect themselves." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, but to Eun-jae, they felt like they had been spoken directly into his chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eun-jae stared at his lap, cheeks burning, while Do-hyun's eyes lingered on him a little longer before turning back toward the door. The night stretched on, slow and heavy, but somewhere between the silence and the small bursts of conversation, something began to shift. The fear that had clutched Eun-jae's chest loosened. The apartment, once suffocating, now felt warmer. He didn't know if it was safety or something else entirely. Panicked, he called the police. His voice shook. He didn't know what he expected, maybe a patrol car that would check the alley and leave. Instead, 5 minutes later, his entire world shifted. The officer who showed up was Kang Do-hyun, tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that made you feel safe just by looking at him. He was calm, but firm, scanning the apartment with sharp eyes. And for Eun-jae, who had always been careful not to let anyone too close, Do-hyun's presence was overwhelming. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. Eun-jae, a university student studying literature, quiet, shy, a little fragile around the edges. He lived through books, escaping into romance manga, yaoi manhwa, and BL stories where love always found its way against impossible odds. Do-hyun, a cop in his early 30s, hardened by the job, disciplined, serious. He wasn't someone who believed in fate or fairy tales. He believed in evidence, in caution, in keeping people safe, even from themselves. And yet, the moment their eyes met, something unspoken sparked. Do-hyun inspected every corner of the apartment, checked the locks, then turned back to Eun-jae. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "But I don't like the look of that window. I'll stay until morning, just to be sure." Eun-jae froze. Stay. The whole night. His chest tightened with a mix of relief and something he couldn't name. The hours stretched slowly, dragging like the hands of a clock moving through molasses. Do-hyun sat by the door, posture rigid, his eyes scanning every shadow in the apartment, every movement that could hint at danger. Even now, with no sound beyond the distant hum of traffic outside, he refused to let his guard down. Every muscle was alert, every sense attuned. He was a sentinel, unmoving yet commanding, a presence that filled the small space more completely than the faint glow of the lamp in the corner. Unjae sat across the room, the sofa a flimsy barrier between him and the officer. He hugged his knees to his chest, fingers idly tracing the seams of his pajama pants. He thought he was trying to distract himself from the pounding of his heart, but he knew better. He was stealing glances when he thought Do-hyun wasn't looking, and every time their eyes met, he felt a jolt that made him flinch, like he'd been caught breaking some unspoken rule. Every detail of the officer stood out. The taut line of Do-hyun's jaw when he focused, the faint shadow of stubble along his cheek, the disciplined sharpness of his uniform, as though he had stepped out of a magazine of heroes, yet somehow didn't belong in Yoonjae's fragile little apartment. His presence was overpowering, magnetic, and unnervingly intimate. Yoonjae couldn't stop thinking about the way Do-hyun's eyes swept across the room, not just alert for threats, but observant, meticulous, as if cataloguing everything about the space and inadvertently everything about him. There was a strange comfort in that, yet it made him wildly aware of his own vulnerability. This stranger had entered his private world, had invaded the sanctum he had built for himself over years, and he felt exposed. A gust of wind rattled the window panes. Yoonjae jumped, and Do-hyun's eyes flicked immediately toward him, sharp and attentive. The officer's gaze softened briefly as he noticed the tremor in Yoonjae's hands. He didn't speak, but the silent acknowledgement sent a shiver through Yoonjae that had nothing to do with fear. Minutes passed, unremarkable, but charged with an electric tension that neither dared break. Yoonjae tried to read, picking up a tattered novel from the coffee table, but his eyes kept slipping to Do-hyun, watching the subtle movements, the shift of weight, the slight tilt of the head, the way he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve absent-mindedly while scanning the room. Everything about him was meticulous and deliberate, and yet somehow fluid, human, impossibly real. "Do you always sit like that?" Yoonjae asked softly. Unable to resist breaking the silence, Do-hyun's gaze flicked to him, eyes narrowing just enough to signal curiosity rather than annoyance. "Sit like what?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, steady as the surface of a deep lake. "Like you're guarding the room." Yoonjae's voice faltered slightly, "Like you're ready to spring into action at any second." Do-hyun gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. "It's my job. You never know when something might happen, even if it seems quiet, even if it seems safe. Vigilance is necessary." Yoonjae's stomach twisted. He wanted to look away, to pretend he wasn't enthralled by this man who seemed both impossibly strong and frighteningly close. But he couldn't. He was captivated by the taut muscles under the uniform, by the way Do-hyun's eyes softened when they met his, even briefly, before returning to watch the empty hallway outside the door. I'm not usually this nervous," Yoonjae admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I live alone, and I'm used to silence. But tonight," his words trailed off, and he shook his head. "It's just different." Do-hyun's eyes lingered on him, and Yoonjae felt like he was being measured, not in a clinical, evaluating way, but in a way that made his heart feel exposed. There was a careful consideration in that look, a mixture of professionalism and something else he couldn't name, something that made the small, cozy apartment feel charged, electric, as if the air between them had thickened. "You'll be fine," Do-hyun said after a moment, voice softer now, almost a whisper. "No one's getting in here tonight. I won't let that happen." Yoonjae swallowed hard. There was a strength in those words, a promise that felt more intimate than any physical touch could be. He nodded, trying to steady his racing heart, but he couldn't stop the heat rising in his chest. The sense of safety Do-hyun exuded was intoxicating, and it made him realize just how tense he had been all evening. Time seemed to stretch and blur. The hum of the city outside became a distant murmur, irrelevant compared to the quiet, persistent presence of the officer across the room. Yoon-jae's thoughts were a tangle of admiration, fear, and something deeper, something that made his stomach flutter and his pulse spike every time Do-hyun shifted in his chair. He noticed little things: the faint scar along Do-hyun's wrist, barely visible under the cuff of his shirt, the way his knuckles tightened when he leaned slightly forward, the subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested a lifetime of responsibility carried silently. Yoon-jae realized he was memorizing him, committing every detail to memory, as if the night might vanish and take Do-hyun with it. At one point, Yoon-jae couldn't resist any longer. He leaned forward slightly, as if to measure the distance between them, and felt the air thrum in response. Their eyes met, and he felt the unspoken energy vibrate between them, raw, tentative, dangerous. "Do you ever get tired of this?" he asked softly. "Of always being on alert, always watching?" Do-hyun didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head slightly, considering. Then, almost quietly, he said, "Every day, but it's part of who I am. It's what I chose. If I don't stay vigilant, no one else will. That's how I measure my worth." The word struck Yoon-jae harder than he expected. He'd never thought about the cost of protection in such stark terms. He imagined the long nights, the weight of responsibility pressing down, the exhaustion beneath the surface of that calm exterior. And yet, Do-hyun carried it effortlessly, or at least, he made it appear that way. Yoon-jae felt a shiver, not from fear, but from awe, from the magnetism of a man so steady, so unwavering, so profoundly alive in his vigilance. He realized then that he wasn't just captivated by the uniform or the authority. He was captivated by the humanity beneath it, by the rare glimpses of vulnerability that flitted across Do-hyun's face when he thought no one was looking. Minutes became hours. Every tick of the clock was a heartbeat in the shared silence, a rhythm that bound them together in that small apartment. Yoon-jae's fingers itched to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but he hesitated, unsure if desire could exist alongside respect, fear, and gratitude. And yet, the tension was undeniable. It grew in the spaces between their words, in the pauses, in the stolen glances. Yoon-jae's heart seemed to synchronize with the quiet presence of the officer, each beat echoing in his chest like a drum calling attention to something unspoken. At one point, Yoon-jae's foot brushed against the edge of the coffee table. Do-hyun's eyes flicked down, sharp and perceptive. "Careful," he said softly, not as a rebuke, but as a warning. The subtle concern in his tone made Yoon-jae's breath catch. Sorry," he whispered, cheeks burning. Do-hyun's gaze softened again, fleetingly, and Yoon-jae felt warmth spread through him, a heat that had nothing to do with fear or adrenaline. It was fascination, longing, maybe even the faint stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to name yet. The rest of the night continued like this. Small movements, careful attention, the occasional word exchanged, but mostly silence, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. Yoon-jae became aware of the rhythm of Do-hyun's presence, the subtle ways he shifted, the tiny habits that marked him as both disciplined and profoundly human. And in that stillness, something bloomed, something fragile, yet insistent, a connection that was silent, almost imperceptible, but powerful, a tether between two people who had come together by chance but might remain bound long after the night ended. Yoon-jae realized he was no longer just observing Do-hyun, he was learning him. Every movement, every glance, every soft murmur of concern was etched into his mind, and with each passing hour the officer's presence became less a shield against danger, and more a light, a warmth, a tether to the world outside his own isolation. By the time dawn began to paint the sky with pale streaks of pink and gold, Yoon-jae found himself leaning just a little closer, almost unconsciously. Do-hyun noticed, of course, but he said nothing, only watching him with those deep, unreadable eyes that seemed to see right through the careful walls Yoon-jae had built around himself. For the first time in a long while, Yoon-jae felt safe. Not just protected, but truly safe. And he knew that when the sun rose fully, the world outside would still be chaotic, still dangerous. But inside this small apartment, something remarkable had begun. Something between them had shifted. Something that would not be undone. "Why did you become a cop?" Yoon-jae finally asked, voice quiet. Do-hyun looked up. "Because someone has to protect the ones who can't protect themselves." His gaze softened just for a moment, and Yoon-jae felt like that answer was meant for him alone. But the night wasn't free of tension. Yoon-jae wasn't used to someone invading his private space. He noticed the way Do-hyun's eyes lingered, concerned, but also curious. He felt exposed, like the officer could read every secret he tried to hide, every BL fan fiction he'd written, every yaoi manhwa volume tucked under his bed, every hidden longing he had never said aloud. At one point, Yoon-jae brought out tea, his hands trembling as he handed a cup to Do-hyun. Their fingers brushed, just a fleeting touch, but enough to send electricity racing through Yoon-jae's body. He quickly looked away, cheeks burning. Do-hyun noticed. He didn't say anything, but his lips curved just slightly. As the hours dragged on, Yoon-jae grew bolder. "Do you ever feel lonely working nights like this?" Do-hyun's answer came after a pause. "All the time." That honesty cracked something open between them. They started talking about books, about music, about dreams Do-hyun had abandoned when he joined the force. Yoon-jae laughed at one of his dry jokes, and Do-hyun found himself staring, wondering why the sound made his chest feel lighter. The break-in had brought them together by chance, but what was growing between them didn't feel like chance at all. The clock struck 3 a.m. The city outside was silent. Inside, the air between them was anything but. Yoon-jae shifted on the couch, finally whispering, "I feel safer with you here than I have in months." Do-hyun's throat tightened. He wasn't supposed to cross lines. He wasn't supposed to want this, but the vulnerability in Yoon-jae's voice pulled at something deeper than duty. "Yoon-jae," he murmured, almost warning, almost pleading. Their eyes locked. For a long moment, neither moved. The distance between them was thin, fragile, breakable. Then, Yoon-jae leaned closer, lips parting, heart pounding so loud he thought it would burst. Do-hyun didn't pull away. He couldn't. The kiss was hesitant, trembling, but when it deepened, it felt inevitable, like this moment had been waiting for them all along. For Yoon-jae, it was every BL story he'd ever dreamed of, suddenly real. For Do-hyun, it was terrifying and liberating all at once. But when they pulled apart, the silence was heavier than before. Duty, morality, reality, all the things standing between them loomed large. Still, neither could deny what had just happened. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains. The world outside looked the same, but inside, nothing was. Do-hyun stood at the door, helmet in hand, his usual composure shaken. "You're safe now," he said again, but his voice carried a different weight. Eun-jae smiled softly, holding his gaze. "I know. They didn't promise anything. They didn't have to. The connection was there, fragile, forbidden, but real. Love doesn't always arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it slips in quietly, in the middle of the night, disguised as protection, revealed as longing. And for Eun-jae and Do-hyun, that night was only the beginning." Gentle tone. "What did you feel watching this story unfold? Was it sweet, emotional, or bittersweet? Comment your reaction below. I read every one. Don't forget to subscribe for more BL webtoon breakdowns and yaoi manhwa love stories. And check the description for full story links and more LGBTQ romance recommendations.